Let's talk about some of the components of emotional intelligence. And I have a feeling that we may be revisiting this in our next program because there's a lot of information, good information, that I think should be covered. There are two main competencies in emotional intelligence. We've got personal competencies and social competencies. And under personal competencies, we look first at self-awareness, which I think really gets at the heart of our program, why it exists and what we, hope to promote. And, self-awareness is our ability to determine what makes us tick.
Right.
And why do particular situations or people provoke us? Why do we respond in situations, to situations in the way that we do? To what extent might our past injuries cause us by default to respond in a certain way? I think that in our culture, we talk about this all the time, Doug, we live in a culture that is moving very fast. I think that there is a premium placed upon busyness. And we're always doing something. We're going from this to this to this to this. And I think that when we have that little bit of downtime or silence, often we might think, maybe there's something wrong.
Yes.
And so we need to fill that with more activities, and we need and more things. And so I think that's a big component of our culture. I think that another aspect of that is that also the premium that's placed upon change. And we live in a makeover culture. We have a makeover mentality.
Right.
We're constantly being encouraged to deconstruct ourselves and to reconstruct them to fit into the latest trends to meet the latest trends of societal acceptability, whatever they are. And so there's this movement, there's this change, all of these things that are enemies to self-awareness, to taking the time to really probe deeply into who we are, why we're here, why we do what we do, why we react the way that we do. And I think that this has an impact upon our organizations and particularly upon our leadership. I think that leaders rarely consider the impact of their personal baggage upon, their practices.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I find often, if you really sit down and talk with a leader and you get to know them and they are open and vulnerable, is that sometimes some of their leadership behaviors that might be occurring now at 50 years old, 50 years of age, may have their origin in something that happened on the playground when they were 7 years old and someone, embarrassed them or hurt them or made them angry. And that wound was never properly addressed and never properly healed. And years later, after all kinds of experiences and education and awards and commendations and all these things, that wound is still festering.
Right. Well, of course, in the literature or in the discussion with coaching, we call these triggers, and we all have triggers, but I want to go back to something that you talked about at the very beginning. We'll come back to triggers in a moment, and that is the whole concept of what makes us tick, what turns us on, what are we passionate about. And one of the things that in working with leaders in all kinds of industries, within this region and nationally and internationally, I know that no one goes out intentionally to do a bad job. I know I've never experienced anyone who programmed themselves to be an ineffective leader intentionally. But what happens along the way is that we have these road bumps, we have these barriers, we have these opportunities in which we may or may not take advantage of them simply because of that past situation that occurred, as you said, from 50 to down to the playground. And how do we manage that? And how do we get the person to be so self-aware that she or he is in a situation where they know how to manage that properly within the context of the organization?
And I think that emotional intelligence is one concept, and there's some accompanying tools that can get us some of that stuff and to at least establish a foundation for a meaningful conversation with leaders to explore some of these things. The other component of personal competencies is self-management. And this is our ability to maintain control over our emotions and impulses as we focus upon our goals. And some people call this self-regulation.
Right.
I think this is another area that is really important in terms of how we lead. And for those that maybe don't have the level of self-management that they should, the organization can get kind of ugly.
Well, it can, and I'm going to give you a personal example of this. You will not understand this. I'm of age, and I have grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And on occasion, I am called to be the babysitter. And sometimes it may be for a week at a time. And so my grandchildren are absolutely lovely. I love them to death. But occasionally, I have to figure out how to self-regulate myself in those settings, because once you reach a certain point, one's patience may not be quite as good as it was when you were 25 or 37 or whatever it turns out to be. And this self-regulation, I have to go back, I pause when I'm with my grandchildren, and when there's a behavior that I didn't approve of or didn't particularly care for, I sit down, I talk with them, I explain to them what's going on, and then I begin to model that. And we have a role, both organizationally and familially in our families, to figure out how we regulate those triggers so that we don't go off on our grandchildren, so to speak. And so what happens is that you begin to model that. And one of the things that effective leaders, reflective leaders in particular, will do is that they'll, one, understand themselves, they'll understand the whole concept of self-management, self-regulation, and then they will model that within the organization. Because I can promise you, as you well know, if a leader is unresponsive, seems to be above it all, hands off or micromanage, it could go from one extreme to the other. That behavior ultimately infiltrates the entire organization from top to bottom. And there are all kinds of examples of huge corporations that you wouldn't think with 50, 60,000 employees, and the behavior of a few at the top impact, and then eventually the whole organization goes away by collapsing. And so what we want to do is that we want to provide an opportunity for people in this community to better understand that reflective moment and self-regulation.
And I think attached to this concept is the idea that, sometimes we think that being transparent with our followers is a good thing, and it may be in many cases. At the same time, a reflective leader, an effective leader, knows what to share, how much to share, and maybe when it's a good time not to share certain things. Well, Doug, we have made it about halfway through our competencies today, and we've covered the personal competencies of self-awareness and self-management, and the social competencies, I think, are where we will begin during our next program. One of the things I'd like to let our viewers know is that the things we're talking about are able to be accessed on a blog. And if you visit thereflectiveleader.wordpress.com, that information is available for you in a blog format. You can feel free to comment, and we welcome that. And this has been fun, Doug.
Yeah, it's been a while, buddy.
It has been.
And it's great. So I appreciate this opportunity for us to be able to do this and share this with the community. And we'll see everybody next month.
That's right. Thank you very much for joining us.